Hey everyone. Some people have accused me of spending an entirely reasonable amount of time extrapolating things to their final conclusion. And today I come to you with an argument that I think English is going to be the only language left. So I think both English is going to survive indefinitely, and that all the other languages are sort of going to become dead or otherwise extinct languages. There will still be written stuff around, but people will actively use English as their only language. So let me explain why I think that. So first off, I think that other than parents teaching their kids their native language, which is super common, the most common reason that people learn another language is economic. And I think that economic force is extremely powerful. If you know somebody who's bilingual or trilingual or whatever, you ask them, like, why did you learn this language? Really common answer is, I moved to this other country. They didn't speak my native tongue, so I had to pick up this other language. So, and why did they move to that other country? Sometimes it's just for fun, but people mostly don't do that. They don't uproot their family and their knowledge of where they were, their links to extended family, and move somewhere else without a good reason. And usually that reason is someone is willing to pay them more. Someone has a valuable job for them to do, and they're willing to pay them. So you move to another country, and you want to learn to speak the language. Or you need to work at a business that speaks that language as a primary, and you have to learn that language to interact with that business. When I was at Google, they said English is the official language of the office. And you'd once in a while run into people speaking Russian or Chinese to each other or something like that. But for the most part, everyone spoke English everywhere. And if you went to one of the foreign offices, they still spoke English there. So there were these little enclaves of English. And I think that force is very, very powerful. And I think the thing that makes that force arise is who in the world controls the wealth and what languages do they speak. So you say, okay, each language sort of controls its own sphere of wealth and its sphere of income. And sometimes there's a mix there. Like someone will speak English and Mandarin, and they're a billionaire who runs a coal mine or something like that. So that wealth belongs to both English and Mandarin. It's split between those, or really they both possess it. But if you say what language in sum has the most value collectively in it, I would argue it's English by a huge amount. And a lot of that's just due to the actions of the former British Empire. They spread imperialism throughout the world. The list of countries that they haven't invaded is a lot shorter than the list of ones that they have. And they brought English with them everywhere they went. And it's had a really big influence on the US and India and Australia and South Africa and Canada. And pretty much all those nations speak English as their primary language because of the actions of the British Empire, or almost English Empire. Hey, I'll get back to the video in just a bit, but first a word from our sponsor, me. I'm working on a thing for like-minded people, like the kind of people who watch these videos, to meet each other, hang out, and chat. It's at together.lol, and it's in super early alpha stage, but come by and tell me what you think. Okay, back to your excellent video. The second force that I think drives language acquisition and really is going to push English to be a lot more valuable is just the internet in general. And of course, you knew I was going to say that. But the internet has more English language content on it than any other language. And it makes English extra valuable because if you learn English instead of whatever language you're currently speaking, you will have access to all those resources. And then on top of that, there's a lot more people who speak English on the internet than basically any other language. And so if you learn how to write English, you can communicate with all of them. So you can ask them for help, or you can tell them about your ideas, or you can advertise your product to them. And that's a really huge force. And when you learn how to use English, at least good enough to use the internet, you don't just gain the ability to talk to everyone and they gain the ability to talk to you, but you gain the ability to read everything that they've ever written, and you gain the ability to write something for them to read. And so that really pushes towards one world language, whatever it is, but already the one internet language is English. Other languages exist, but which one's the dominant one? It's English. The final reason, and the thing that I think will finally exterminate the remaining languages, is political. And so when a country formally adopts a language, like many countries have formally adopted English, although not the United States, when they formally adopt one, usually that changes the way that practices occur. So that country is going to start teaching it officially in schools. They're going to offer it as an elective for the type of countries that offer electives. And they're going to start writing official documents in whatever plus English. And that starts migrating more and more people towards learning English, especially if it's the type of country that speaks like 10 plus languages natively. Then if you learn to speak English, you can speak English with all the other people who speak all the other languages, but also know English. And so that really kind of unifies the country. And I think that happens more with English than one of the native languages of that country. I guess a good example would be India with Hindi. I think English is going to take over before everyone in India learns how to speak Hindi. And I think we'll also see that in China for the various dialects that aren't Mandarin, but that's going to take much longer. So another thing that pushes the world towards learning English is baked into a bunch of standards. So if you've looked at FTP or HTTP, or if you've programmed for the most part, all of those have English keywords in them. Like in HTTP, it'll just say head, get, post. There's just English words written in there, and it doesn't support using another language. If you program Java, you say public static void main string args. And if you speak a different language, you still have to write it in English. And that, I think, is more of an argument for why English isn't going away. But really, that was the thing that made me start thinking about this. I realized, hey, all the programming languages, just about, there's a few exceptions, have English keywords. And how does that feel if you speak a different language? And I mean, it feels a little bad. You have to learn those English terms. But I started thinking, we never really get rid of old code. Like there's old COBOL code from, I don't know, a billion years ago that's still running payroll systems, and it has a bunch of English in it. So the world is never really going to be able to excise all of the English unless there's some kind of very strange one world government, and then they turn everything upside down with some kind of policy that says we have to get rid of English everywhere. But other than that, I think that we're never going to get rid of English. And that's really the thing that made me start thinking of that. So the other thing is, as Wikipedia puts it, there's a prestige language. So there might be a heritage language and then a prestige language. And that's their way of sort of saying this other language is higher status. And I think that we see instances of that with other countries adopting English, like English phrases, as something cool. So one example that comes to mind is K-pop. In K-pop songs, they'll frequently incorporate a bunch of English. There's English in Gangnam Style. And you don't really see it go the other way. There's not a lot of English language songs that I hear in the US that have a little bit of Korean in them just to be a little bit cool. Maybe there's a loan word, but they don't just stick Korean in that nobody knows how to speak. And you do see that with English. I really enjoyed watching this particular video. I'll try to link it in the description, but it was a guy going around Japan asking Japanese people how to say extremely common things in Japanese. Sometimes there is a Japanese word for it. I think sometimes there wasn't. And sometimes there's a sort of awkward Japanese phrase. But he's just asking them things like escalator and menu. And can you say that? And then sometimes he accidentally slips into saying it in English himself. But it really shows the power of English loanwords and how they've spread to every single language around the world. I'd also argue that an important factor in this is, okay, so if English is going to win, all the other languages have to go away. So something that could happen is another language arises, Esperanto or something, and it replaces everything. I don't think any new languages are ever going to arise organically ever again. I think the thing that really drove that is people migrated to a far enough communication distance from sort of the base that they came from that they could build a dialect and then eventually a new language that was separate and unintelligible from the previous one. And it's too late for that now. Everyone has already spread everywhere around the world and created light speed communication lines between each other. So other than maybe uncontacted tribes, maybe they're still synthesizing new languages like crazy, but I don't think any new large language is ever going to arise again. We're only going to see language loss. We're never going to see a new language show up. So I'd also like to talk about mechanically, what is it that stops a language from getting passed on? And I'm going to argue from secondhand experience talking to Chinese and other people, mostly at work, but it's really like you immigrate to, say, the US, you speak Chinese, you teach your children Chinese, maybe you speak Chinese to them, maybe English, and then they have children. And eventually those sort of second generation immigrants mostly only use Chinese to talk to their grandparents. And if you go another generation down, now it's only to talk to your great grandparents because everyone else speaks English really fluently. And that's where you start having this question of, do we bother teaching our kids that? I know among Chinese immigrants, it's really common to send their kids to Chinese school. If you know someone Chinese, ask them about that. Did you go to Chinese school? And they'll be like, oh my gosh, yes, it was terrible. But mostly they'll speak fluent English anyway. And they'll tell you about how bad their Chinese is. But that's the thing that I think mechanically really gets rid of a language, is when it's no longer useful for talking to anyone but your grandparents. And the way that someone learns that new prestige language is they migrate because of economic forces. And then the way that it goes away is they have enough generations under the prestige language in the new economic area. And then there's no point to the heritage language anymore. It doesn't let you talk to anybody or communicate with anything that's as interesting or valuable. So why bother teaching it to your kids? So in order for English to win, it also has to defeat all the competitors. And so who are those? So Mandarin, by far the biggest. I'll get to that in a bit. Hindi. I don't think Hindi is a real challenger. I think India is more interested in learning English than spreading Hindi. I don't think Hindi is spreading super fast. And I think it's more likely that India transforms into English as a main language than Hindi spreads to other countries. It seems unlikely to me. There's Spanish. Spanish does not have a huge amount of the wealth in the world. So it's a big language, lots of speakers. New speakers show up all the time. But I think Spanish speakers would be more interested in learning English than English speakers are in learning Spanish. There's French, same thing, Spanish. Arabic, I don't know. Someone could argue with me and say, hey, Arabic is actually going to take over. I don't think so. Also, I'd be really surprised if a right to left language took over, but maybe. So anyway, so Mandarin is an interesting case. Mandarin's the most spoken first language in the world. And you might say, why is that? And it's because of China, of course. It's the most spoken language in China by a lot. It's the most spoken first language. But it's not really spoken very much anywhere else. It's only in China. There's a few tiny other places, like Hong Kong, something like that, but it's just China. And so I think what's going to end up happening is English will be the only language left, except for Chinese, or except for Mandarin, for a little while. And then Mandarin will gradually collapse, or China will go through a policy change and they'll say, you know what, English is the official language. Or now we're teaching 2 languages. Everyone will be like, oh, okay, let's just do English. But I do think that Mandarin in China will be one of the last languages left. And we'll be waiting on a political change from China to finally get rid of it, or however you think of it. But I think that that's kind of a special case. English is the most spoken language in the world, but it's not the most spoken first. And it's because of China and Mandarin. It's a weird exception, except that it's the biggest exception. So in the future, I've done a little bit of research, and people seem to think that there's about 7,000 languages right now. That sounds both low and high to me, but what do I know? And they predict that by 2050, we'll only have 700 languages left. That means by 2050, it'll start getting much easier to make this argument. You'll be able to start looking at the top 10 and say, who's making gains, who's losing the most, and predict which one's going to be left. But I think also that 7,000 to 700 really indicates that I'm at least right in saying there will be only one language left. I think the primary argument would be, is it English? I guess you could also argue somehow there will be two. There will be two languages forever, or 10, or whatever. Maybe? I don't think so. I think the pressure is going to push people into one, just one. So I feel like people will want to impose a value judgment on this. Like, is it bad? Whenever I read things about languages going away, there's always this sort of implicit tone over the article or whatever it is, where people are mourning the loss of a language. And I think you can view a language as sort of, it's a meme. It's like a set of concepts that people share between each other, and then they use it to share more concepts between each other. And a meme really only exists as long as it's useful. And when it stops being useful to people, it's not really a huge loss that it's gone, because nobody needs it. Nobody needs to use it. There are a few languages that have special features in them. Famously, there's one where everyone refers to cardinal directions when they talk about where something is. They don't say it's to my right, they say it's to the west. And that's cool and all, but you could just graph that feature onto English. And now that you know it exists, are you interested in doing that? And it's not worth the tax of learning an entire language and having other people learn an entire language just so that you can speak about whether things are north instead of to your right. It's not worth it. And so if all those people learn how to speak English, sure, preserve the cardinal direction thing, but it's not worth having this extra language around. And I would argue that for most languages, we will lose certain things that those languages can do, but they could be grafted in English if they're worth keeping. And I think oftentimes they're not. And the tax of having a different language is super high. It takes a long time to learn a new language. It takes a long time if you're a child, and it takes a long time as an adult. And I don't know, when people are imagining, or when they're talking about how bad it is to lose a language, I don't think that they're thinking how bad it would be to force more people to learn the language in order to keep it around. And so if it naturally dies, it seems like the right thing to me. So the other part of the value judgment is it good? Would it be good for everyone to just speak one language? And I think the answer is a definitive yes. Whenever you learn English, you can talk to everyone who knows English. They can talk to you. You can write stuff and you can read stuff. And to me, that seems like a huge win. I feel like it would be so great if people could do that already. Everyone around the globe wants to be able to communicate with each other for the most part, but they can't. I don't think this is going to stop all wars or anything. People will still have war. They'll just have it with English on both sides. So they'll be able to understand each other and then still fight about it anyways. But it'll just be so useful for things like science, for business, for everyone to be able to speak the same thing. And it'll be really useful for anyone who wants to learn something else. They'll have access to all the English language resources on it instead of, I don't know, what if you only speak Swahili? It's much harder to do research, right? So I see this as being a really good thing. I think it would be great if in 100 years, everyone voluntarily just knows English and they speak English. I think that'd be a really great future to live in. Anyway, if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. I would be glad to argue with you about it. Maybe someone has some really strong argument for why this isn't the case. And if so, let me know. And if you found this to be an interesting topic or eye-opening, please let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to come to together.lol and come hang out with us and chat. I'd love to have you there, and I'd love to get your feedback.